Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Purple Pill Philosophy is interviewing Christian Casey for part 2 of our discussion on Egypt.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing today, my good sir?
Is that me?
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm doing good.
either one would work. You doing good, Carlos?
It's rainy over here, and that always sucks, but other than that, not bad.
It's raining
All
here
right.
too. It's raining. We got a cold front though, so it's supposed to get cold tomorrow.
I suppose we can. What was that?
Oh, nothing. I'm just
Oh. I
chatting.
suppose
All right.
we can start off by discussing how we came across you in the first place, where you talked
Yeah.
about you talked about with your interview with Digital Hammer, in which you discussed Assassin's Creed Origins and the relevance of video games, which is the most immersive and arguably the best platform for storytelling, more so than movies in the last 20 years in particular.
Or books.
Mhm.
Although I will
I think
say
it's a
book.
very different. It's a different sort of medium. I mean, like the medium is the message to some extent. Like the medium sort of defines what can be said and what sort of stories are told. But for experiencing a place, I think there's really nothing better. At least nothing that we have now that is anywhere close to as immersive as a video game for, experiencing a different world.
Yeah, if you were to tell this like 50 years ago or like 70 years ago or somewhere around there, if you were to go back in time and tell people that one day they'll make movies where you control the characters yourself, and they'll be like, that's
Yeah.
mad.
Yeah, that sounds so sci-fi. I mean, it's just, it's
Well,
absolutely
then again,
remarkable.
if you went back in time like 400 or 500 years and you told people that witches didn't exist, they would call you a witch.
Yeah, originally video games were meant to pass the time. You weren't really meant to think about them that much. That is until we reached the golden age of PlayStation in the late 90s, which coincided with the Attitude Era of wrestling, where video games got more sophisticated and complex with games like Final Fantasy 7 and 8, Parasite Eve, and Metal Gear Solid. And I'm one of the biggest fans of Assassin's Creed you'll ever meet, and it was great to see a full-on representation of ancient Egypt outside of minor ones like we see in Crash Bandicoot Warped and Tomb Raider 4.
Yeah, there are a few in, I think it was Unreal Tournament had quite a few, like Egyptian temple maps and those sorts of things that were, I liked them anyway. I mean, I played it. I don't know how old you guys are, but I don't know if people still do this, but when I was in high school, we would everybody had a desktop computer. Like hardly anybody had a laptop. So you would take the computer to somebody's house and network them and play video games against each other. We always play Unreal Tournament. So
Yeah, well, now it's more convenient with online gaming and having a bunch of 12-year-old kids screaming at each other.
yeah, I hear about that all the time. I've never done it. I've never played an online multiplayer game. And I had Red Dead and that had a multiplayer and I never even tried it. So yeah, that must be cool.
A few times. It's just not. I'm more of a story guy.
Yeah. Also, I'm just kind of terrible at video games, to be honest. I can play it myself and I have a lot of fun, but if I'm playing against someone else, it's just they're so much better at it that it's kind of just pointless.
I was wondering, since you actually do have expertise in the fields, do you ever come across a video game that you play and you just notice all the inaccuracies in them when it comes to the history?
Yeah. So things that depict Egypt, it's a really mixed bag because Egypt has this pretty well-defined and consistent artistic canon that we see starting in the Old Kingdom, and it changes. Of course, you can notice slight nuances, and you can notice some evolutions too. But it's fairly consistent. And then, so when you look at any, sort of Egyptomania object, it's immediately obvious that the person making it didn't really understand proportions or hadn't spent enough time looking at real Egyptian objects, it's obvious in the same way. I'm trying to think of a good metaphor. I'm having a hard time coming up with one, but it's sort of obvious in the way that, like, listening to someone speak with a foreign accent is really obvious if they're speaking your native language, but in another language might not be so obvious. Sort of like when you know something that well and you've just spent so much time engaged with it, you can see immediately when something's a bit off. So, you go to like an Egyptian movie theater, one of these really cool, like Art Deco Egyptian Revival movie theaters, and like all the proportions are totally wrong. They just like things are like too wide, or like, it just feels off.
That famous one in Hollywood.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been to that one. I've been to a few of them, and like the Fox Theater in Atlanta it kind of has this like arabesque, like Egyptian Revival style that's really cool. And I remember going there when I was much younger. I think I was a teenager and went and saw something there, and I just thought it was the coolest place in the world. And I went there more recently, and it was so obvious to me how, like, where things were not quite right. So that's a view of things that's changed in my own lifetime. And now, just because I've spent so much time looking at Egyptian stuff that it's just internalized. So now if I play a video game that has an Egyptian level or something, most of the time they're just way off. And that's the thing that's so cool about Assassin's Creed Origins, that I think it helped when I wanted to talk about it in an academic setting, because I can show screenshots from the game, and Egyptologists are looking at those and they're seeing the same thing that I'm seeing, which is that everything looks like you expect it to. Things just don't have that kind of like out of kilter feeling to them that so much, Egyptian Revival or Egyptian reproductions have.
And you mentioned that you volunteered to give them linguistic advice on it, and they rejected it or something.
Oh yeah, so that was my only major criticism, was that they kind of phoned it in on the language. And the way they did, they were real honest about it. They, basically said that wasn't our priority, and so the way we handle that sort of thing is we make a list of words in the target language, send them to our sound guy. He combines them as he sees fit according to the way things sound or whatever, personal preference, and then records them and puts them in the game. So what you end up with in the game is a thing that's sort of vaguely like Egyptian, while almost always being so far off that it just doesn't mean anything. And like one of the big things that happens is, so when we talk about Egyptian language, if you talk about Egyptian language anytime before the 4th century AD, so most of what we consider pharaonic history, we don't actually have any good record of how the words sounded. So hieroglyphs record phonetic values, but they only record the consonants. So we're missing all the vowels, basically. And in some cases, we don't even know where the vowels are supposed to be. So we just have like an empty sequence of consonants that has vowels between them somewhere. So what Egyptologists do for convenience is they just put E sounds between all of the consonants. So for example, you might see a name like Amenhotep instead of Amunhotep. And what's happening there is that the Amenhotep version, or Emenhotep, I guess, is a sort of artificial pronunciation of just the consonants with vowels thrown in, kind of dummy vowels wherever necessary. And that's done in order to be scientific. It marks how much we know. So if you hear one of those E vowels in a word somewhere, it means we have no idea what it sounded like, but we can guarantee that it didn't sound like that. So it's the only thing we're certain it didn't sound like. And then if we use later Coptic, which of course has written vowels, we can reconstruct things and pronounce them as though they were Coptic. So I could say Amunhotep, and that matches the Coptic vowels in those words, but it's anachronistic, and it could be anachronistic by more than 1,000 years, as it is in that case. So you basically have these two paradigms of pronunciation that are both wrong in different ways. And oddly, in Assassin's Creed, they went for the Egyptological pronunciation, even though, because of when the game is set, we actually do know a lot about what the language would have sounded like, and it's not so anachronistic to pronounce it as Coptic. So, Amun-Hotep would be perfectly fine in the time period that Assassin's Creed is set in. So it seems a little odd to me that they made that choice, and it also just seems like a terrible missed opportunity, because even if you're not interested in Egyptian language, I think you get something out of knowing that the thing you're listening to is authentic. And if you are at all interested in it, then you're getting excellent listening practice, because you're hearing the same phrases over and over for dozens of hours, and they're being kind of embedded in your brain. And then my evidence for this, I took a bunch of Reddit posts where people who had played the game were posting their versions of phrases that they heard and asking what they meant in Egyptian. And most of the time they're just gibberish, but it showed that people who knew nothing about the Egyptian language were actively listening and trying to figure out what people were saying. If there were some authentic language behind that, those people would have got a really cool answer. And instead that wasn't an option. So yeah, there you go.
Well, there does seem to be kind of a lot of time compression elements in Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, it's like a central theme in the game.
There's also
to be fair, like even in like stories in the ancient world, there's a lot of time compression that's used as well.
Yeah.
Because in many cases you have, oral traditions that go back all these times, and you're trying to squeeze them all together into a coherent narrative.
Yeah,
and so
go ahead.
So you're going to get like a sort of a time frame. Like if you were to, that's why sometimes you'll read something and you'll see, wait, this logically couldn't have come like at this point, because they're not so much interested in chronological, but in just narrative purposes.
Yeah, well, I was mainly talking about the main Assassin's Creed storylines, which is one set in the present day where you experience the past and you have all that going on. And yeah, the main first few games was about the preventing the end of the world coming in 2012, and then later games after that, you live the experience as a video game company, like in that setting. And then with Origins, more recently, you had the virtual museum tour, where they give you all these facts about ancient Egypt and what daily life was like and the pyramids.
Yeah, those tours are really neat. I know quite a few professors of Egyptology are using it in the classroom too. So it's.
But what really they did kind of did some inaccurate parts with it, like the Library of Alexandria part and all that. But most of
it's reconstructed. I mean, we don't really know much about it, so it could have looked like that, I suppose.
Yeah, it was just about the scroll size in the books, and they didn't have all that, and they blamed the burning of the library on the big bad Christians, and it wasn't like that. But
there's a good article about that it's on JSTOR actually. Let me see if I can pull that up. It's kind of standard reading on this subject, and it happens to be written by one of my colleagues, one of my coworkers at ISAW. So he was the director of ISAW until a few years ago. I'm not sure the exact timeline. But Roger Bagnall, really interesting guy. The Alexandria Library of Dreams is kind of the classic reading about this, and I just got it online without much effort. I just typed in the title. So anybody who wants to go read this definitely should, because it kind of he goes through the possible scenarios and kind of the implications and the reasons that people liked that explanation, and sort of concludes, if I remember correctly, he concludes that it was really like a combination of factors and deterioration, and no single person or group of people is really totally responsible.
Right. Tim O'Neill also has an excellent article on historyforatheists.com where he debunks New Atheist bad history.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I've never seen it.
Yeah. Let me see. I could probably get it up myself.
Anyway, until then, what would be your favorite movie about ancient Egypt?
My favorite movie is it, it's it's such a dorky answer. My favorite movie is this Polish movie called Pharaoh. Let me see if I can
Yeah,
find it.
it's supposed to be this fictional story about the supposed last pharaoh of the glory days, this fictional Ramesses the 13th, even though the last Ramesses was 11th. And
Yeah,
he's in competition with these priests of Amon who are conspiring against him, and all this political instability.
that's exactly it. I am absolutely stunned, Carlos, that you have seen this movie because it is not a popular movie among anyone except Egyptologists. It's honestly not a very good movie in terms of like pacing and story and all those, um, the kind of things that you talk about when you walk out of the movie theater.
At least they get the skin color more accurate than most movies like that.
Yeah, they get a lot of things right. So the I forget the name of the Egyptologist, um, but it was a famous Egyptologist, Polish Egyptologist in the 1960s that consulted with them. Are you
Yeah.
guys seeing this right now?
Yeah. Anyway, this here's Brass's screen share.
Yeah,
Oh, cool.
this is the History for Atheists by Tim O'Neill. This is the Great Myths 5, the destruction of the Great Library of Alexandria. If anyone is interested, that's the link, and that's the what you'll expect to find. It's pretty lengthy, but it really goes into it.
But anyway, my favorite movies about ancient Egypt. I really liked The Egyptian. It was in back in the 50s, but it
Yeah.
was completely overshadowed by the Ten Commandments, which was actually a sequel to it.
Oh, I didn't realize that was supposed to be a sequel. The Egyptian it's a kind of a composite of multiple real ancient Egyptian stories.
Yeah,
That was definitely pretty neat.
there's time compression in there as well, since it's mainly about Akhenaten, and then near the end, not to spoil too much, but it goes immediately in the succession of Horemheb, who actually came after who came after King Tut, who came after Akhenaten's other son we know very little about.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we have to always remember with history, a lot of times, especially with ancient history, it's always about cobbling together fragments of what we can get.
I know it's really good, but a lot of people haven't heard of it because of the Ten Commandments.
Yeah. I think it's a better movie, personally. But,
Yeah.
there you go.
Okay, back to Egypt. Let's talk about religion, which was the most important aspect of everybody's everyday life back then. People used to talk about the gods like we talk about going bowling or the movies or the restaurant. Egypt isn't Egypt without them. So let's start with the overlord, Ra.
Yeah. So, I mean, his Coptic name is Ray. Ray just means sun. So he is just literally like the deified sun, as in the sun in the sky. Um, and so he's sort of a creator deity. Um, he's associated with Atum, who's the creator in one version of the creation myth, and kind of the head of the Ennead, the kind of group of 9 central deities. So obviously he's very important. The sun was very important. That arose in the Old Kingdom. Actually, there was a rise in worship of the sun that I don't think we know exactly how all the different versions come together, but there's this interesting combination of the
Um,
solar cycle and the solar myth with the funerary myths and the underworld. So, the sun travels through the sky every single day. In Depending on the version of the myth, he's traveling. So you can imagine the world is being envisioned as kind of like a bubble of air in this infinite sea of creation. And so the sun is actually traveling on the underside of the top of that bubble of air. So he's traveling on an ocean that is above the sky, essentially. And then when he goes below the horizon, there's a big question about what happens. And in the funerary text, Ray has to kind of fight his way out of the underworld every night in order to rise again the next morning.
Yeah, he also defeats the Chaos Serpent Apep every night.
Yeah, so that's a part of it.
That would be.
If I may be allowed one bad pun, which is typical when it comes to Egyptology, what's the first stage of grief in Egypt? Denial.
Oh my gosh,
I had to get that one out there.
It's true in general, but
okay.
So Ra was originally the.
I believe, just to get back on topic with it, I believe there was sort of a combination with Amun-Ra.
Yeah, Ra and Amun.
Yeah, so this is a thing that is much broader than that. So we call it syncretism, and syncretism refers to anytime different religious ideas are joined together, and in Egyptology specifically, it refers to this thing that happened over time where different deities are being perceived as aspects of one deity. So I think last time I talked about Sekhmet and Hathor as being kind of a violent and a nurturing aspect of one goddess. We have the same thing with Re, where he is later linked with Amun. And Amun at first his name means the hidden one. He's the patron god of the city of Thebes. And then he kind of develops to be like essentially a personification of Egypt, or the Egyptian state, maybe might be a better way to say it. So then, of course, because you have this preeminent solar deity that's kind of the center of all religious thinking or theology, and then you have this very prominent and like politically important deity that even common people feel a connection to, it makes sense that those two things would be seen as aspects of one thing. It makes sense both in practical terms because there's a political expedience to framing things in that way, and also just in sort of theological terms.
So, people. Okay, so before we go further on this, so just to be clear to the audience, that Upper Egypt is the south, which is more African, and Lower Egypt is the north, which is more Oriental. And
the opposite of America.
So in the Upper and Lower Egypt, they each either thought Ra was supreme, the other one thought Amun was supreme, and during the unification of the New Kingdom, they sort of became identified with each other by the priests, or is it more? Am I right so far?
I don't know that Egypt can really be understood as being sort of closer in one place to one thing. I mean, it makes sense that there would be a certain amount of cultural diffusion, and that, in Upper Egypt, there might be more elements of other African cultures that are kind of becoming part of Egyptian culture as well. Yeah, I just don't necessarily see it. It makes sense that it would work that way, but I don't know of any evidence that that's actually how things.
Yeah, Egypt was its own world. I'm just talking about various slight connections.
And there are certainly connections in just about any direction. So there are connections to other African cultures, and connections to like Levantine culture, and even Mesopotamian culture, and things farther away. I just don't know that there's any sort of dissimilarity between North and South that also mirrors things that are outside of the borders in those directions. It makes sense that there would be, though. I'm from Texas, and there's a whole lot of influences from Mexican culture in Texas that I don't find in New York, of course. So it's kind of natural that you might see things like that. I just can't think of any evidence for it. So I don't know that you're wrong. I also can't confirm that that's correct.
Where I was getting at is that
have the references to the, the ripping out of your heart, like, as in the Aztec culture. Aztec are mine, but it's actually, I actually learned something pretty neat about that. The sort of cultures and why they did that sort of human sacrifice.
Where I was getting at is that one part of Egypt thought Ra was supreme, while the other part of Egypt thought Amun was supreme, and the priests brought them together during the New Kingdom to settle alliances.
Yeah, there's probably some truth to that. I'm
Yeah,
not
and
totally
they
sure.
had them do a fusion dance like in Dragon Ball Z, and they just sort of merged.
There you go.
Oh yeah,
Or they
fun
put on-
fact. Amun was actually one of the main antagonists of the sequel series of Avatar: Last Airbender.
Oh, is
Oh,
that
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Wait, the sequel series, like The Legend of Korra?
yeah.
Oh, I've never seen that.
Anyway, it's like anime. Anyway, what's the significance of Horus and Set? Were they we're getting the sense that Ra is the god of the sun, but it's also Horus.
Yeah, it is. And how exactly does that work? Funny thing is, it sort of makes sense to me, but then I don't really know how to explain it. So one of the really clear connections is that there are these different manifestations of Ray depending on where he is. So when he's in the middle of the sky, he's just the sun, or he is, Aten. When he descends into the underworld, he is he becomes this like ram-headed figure, or he's Osiris. And then when he's born the next morning, he is Khepri, who is like, the creation. His name just means like creation. And that's the scarab beetle deity. Sometimes you'll see him depicted as like a man with just like a beetle head. It's the most ridiculous looking thing. And then he is Re Harakti, which is like Re, who is also Horus of the horizon. So there's, obviously a connection between the two there. And then there's a connection in ideas, falcons fly through the air, sun flies through the air. And that's, again, where you get this sort of thing where the animal aspect of the deity also reflects some feature of its personality that is prominent. So the sun being this giant thing that flies across the sky, and the fact that we have a powerful flying deity, it makes sense that those two things would be associated. But Horus and Set, that's a kind of a different story. It's a bit of a mess too, because we don't actually have the ancient Egyptian version of the Osiris myth. But the basic story that survives from classical authors is that Seth tricks Osiris, chops him up. Wait, there's like two stages. He tricks him, murders him. He ends up as like a tree in like the king of Byblos's palace, and then Isis finds him, and then Set chops him up, and she puts him back together, and then she gives birth to Horus. And then Osiris becomes like the king of the underworld because he's basically still dead. He's like a mummy. And then so Set is kind of like, I think of it like Mufasa and Scar and
Yeah.
Simba. Like Horus would be like Simba, and Set is Scar, because it's Horus's uncle, but then they have to kind of fight over control of the throne. Some people have suggested that there might be a remnant of a real life political like succession issue during the Old Kingdom, in which an uncle and a son were both vying for the throne, and then it was kind of mythologized in the form of this story.
Yeah, Lion King was actually actually based on Moses' story and Joseph's, as well as Hamlet.
Yeah, and I think it's a very common story that's been told lots of times, and it has a very obvious like social expedience, like who inherits. If you have an agricultural society and a civilization that kind of depends on the notion of inheritance in order to like motivate people to work hard so that they can leave things for their children, you really need a way of establishing why being someone's son means that you get their stuff, because that's actually a really difficult rule to establish a priori, because there's just no reason why it should be true. But we want it to be true, so we need a myth.
Wasn't Horus originally Osiris and Isis's brother, or is that another Horus?
Yeah, so sometimes he's their brother and sometimes their son. I think it depends on. I mean, and these all of these things they were told for thousands of years. Naturally, there are different versions, and there are even kind of conflicting versions that coexist. I would compare it to like something like the Marvel universe, including the comic books, where you have things have been rebooted, things have been retconned, and you just end up with a kind of this tangled mess of things that are sometimes directly contradictory and yet simultaneously true.
Because the average person can look at Egyptian religious beliefs and they're like, they couldn't even make their minds up what God is what, who's the father of who, and who rules over what, and what power belongs to who.
I think they would have said that they're not particularly interested in making their minds up. That's the general kind of consensus of Egyptology.
Like all they care about is that they're there.
Yeah, and I think so. There's this notion of like polyvalent logic, where you don't have these very reliable sort of axiomatic rules about like what contradiction means, and what sorts of things can be simultaneously true. I feel like Egyptian religious thought actually just makes more room for contradiction than we do.
And there's also Osiris is supposed to be the god of the underworld, but that's also Anubis's role, the jackal.
Anubis is a psychopomp, so his role is to escort the recently deceased to the underworld, perhaps through the underworld. But Osiris has a different role. He's like the king of the underworld.
So Anubis is like that, like a Cerberus and Charon mixed together.
Sure, yeah.
Makes sense.
And there's Sobek, who's the crocodile-headed god. He's the god of the Nile, and somebody else would say that Hapi is the baboon-headed god, is the god of the Nile.
Yeah, and I can never. I've looked it up and read about it like 1,000 times. I can never remember what Sobek is the god of. It's like something vague that I just don't connect with crocodiles, so I just can never remember.
I think it's the Nile because that's where crocodiles lived.
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll go with it.
I don't know. They're all. Anyway, the other night we mentioned, speaking of gods, we were talking about living gods now, which, why did they worship animals again? Certain animals?
So animals were associated with specific deities, and I think it just goes back to a way of conceptualizing what this thing is and represents and what its personality is like. So I think I said last time, like a cow has a different personality from a lion. If you want your goddess to be like a nurturing mother and a symbol of fertility, a cow fits much better than a lion does. If you want her to be kind of violent and ruthless, a lion fits better. So there's a connection between the personality of the animal and that of the deity. And it's also it's kind of a model in the way that in like a model of physics. So you could think about like the various models of the atom. Atoms aren't really kind of this like central nucleus with electrons spinning around them in an orbit like a planet, but we draw that model and use it as a symbol because it's a convenient way of understanding something that's totally foreign to us. And then, of course, there are more sophisticated models than that and less sophisticated models than that. I think these animal avatars and the notion of the animal's personality and all of those things are ways of providing mental touchstones to understand something that is very abstract and very unfamiliar. So if you're talking about these primordial deities of the air and earth and sky, Geb, the god of the earth, kind of just is the earth. Newt just is the sky. We think of, if you're familiar, I'm sure everybody is. If you're more familiar with like Greek mythology, you have like Zeus, who's the god of thunder, but it means he's kind of like the boss of thunder. He isn't thunder itself; he is in control of thunder. Whereas Egyptian deities tend to just be that thing. So if that thing behaves a certain way, like if the notion of violence, if we conceptualize it in a certain way, we could attribute to that lionine qualities because it's like violence is like the way that a lion behaves. So it's a way of ascribing something concrete and intuitive to these abstract ideas that might seem unfamiliar if you tried to negotiate them kind of on their own.
Oh yeah, speaking of Zeus, when Alexander took over and the Egyptians praised him as a deliverer, and they ushered in this fantastic age which blended Egyptian and Greek culture. They synchronized Zeus and Amun. Like, I have a hard time imagining people actually believe that, since they look absolutely nothing alike. Or acting.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. So there's this thing in metaphor. Oh, I forgot the name of it. Associativity or something. No, that's the different thing. But basically, if we metaphorically connect to totally different things, we naturally pick out the things that they might have in common in order to associate. So that my go-to example is like time flies like an arrow. That's clearly a metaphor. And time and arrows have almost nothing in common, except that they could be understood to sort of move quickly and inexorably in a single direction. So we don't think of time as having feathers or being fired from a bow or any of the other things that we associate with arrows. Those really aren't relevant for the comparison. And the same applies to any sort of syncretism between two deities. Zeus is the preeminent deity in Greek mythology, and Amun is the preeminent deity in Egyptian mythology. They're both male. They're both kind of like kingly figures. So when they're syncretized, they're merged into one thing, but what's left is really the intersection of those two things. So the things they have in common are the personality of that new deity. And that's Zeus Amun is really, he's just like a strongman king type deity.
Also kind of like Hermes and Thoth being together, as well as this obviously created deity of Serapis, which blended Osiris and Hades.
Wait, Osiris and Hades. Serapis was Osiris and Hades. Okay, yeah, it makes sense. That like those two clearly have
the statue of Hades,
prominent
accessories of Osiris.
Right.
Well, as long as we all remember that all the Greek deities got killed by Kratos, we're good.
God of War. That's another great series.
I mean, I always thought that didn't make sense. Like, they already went for the Norse gods. I think that would have made more sense if they would have just stuck for the Norse gods. Because the Norse gods could actually die. The Greek gods were just immortal and couldn't die.
And that's taking them as the caricatures that Greek mythology makes them out to be.
Well, yeah. I'm just saying, it would have made more sense to just stick with Norse mythology, because that makes sense with their culture, because it's not just that the gods could die, it's just that they will die. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah. Anyway, Greek mythology is more familiar and interesting. But
it's more familiar, interesting than Norse. I feel like Norse mythology is more interesting, personally.
Well, yeah, it is interesting. It brought about Lord of the Rings and Narnia and stuff like that. And
Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology is really good. That's a pretty awesome read.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, as long as we also remember that, Thanos really did a number on Thor, we're good.
Yeah, he was supposed to be one of the Titans.
I could never get through Endgame. I tried to watch it fairly recently, and it's so boring. Oh my gosh.
I mean, it wasn't good as Infinity War.
Yeah, Infinity War was super confusing. I saw it at the theater, and I remember like I saw it with my wife and a friend of ours, and we walked out, and we were like, we have no idea what just happened.
Anyway, I
Oh,
agree.
she had never seen another Marvel movie until that one, so
I
she was just like had no idea.
It doesn't make sense unless you watch all of them, but I agree wholeheartedly with Scorsese that Marvel movies and DC movies and all this superheroes trending stuff is more like theme parks instead of cinema.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you define it, and I think that's also relevant to our conversation about video games as a storytelling medium. Um, Movies went through kind of the same thing that video games are still in the process of going through now, where they were so clunky, and you kind of just had to be there for the novelty of the thing more than really for the story that was being told. And then they got more sophisticated to the point that
Yeah.
they could tell stories, and they could have this emotional impact, and they could be considered art, really.
Yeah,
I feel like
one of the first blockbusters was Intolerance, which took place over 4 different time periods and went through in sequence back and forth until they culminated in the end.
I've never seen that. That's a really early film.
Yeah, like 1916.
Never seen
It's
it.
really good, but it's when America was getting out of the Wild West and we were heading into World War One.
Right.
I know. I mean, it's funny. Superhero movies are basically the new cowboy movies.
Yeah, I think they're fun. I mean, Scorsese's argument that they aren't really films in the artistic sense, or they aren't really cinema. I mean those kind of demean the same thing. This high art version of the thing. I don't really know what that means. It just doesn't. It's a statement that doesn't really say anything.
Like it doesn't speak to the heart or is really intellectual in a way. It's just eye candy or roller coaster ride.
Sure, but they aren't claiming to be high art, so it feels like accusing them of being dishonest when they're never claiming to be that thing. They're supposed to just be fun, and that's okay.
Spielberg manages to do both with Jurassic Park.
Yeah, most of his movies actually.
Yeah,
Makes them so good.
yeah.
As long as it sticks to the T-Rex, that's always a good thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
even though they did not look like that, they were like T-Rex probably looked like a giant roadrunner from hell. But other than that, it's yeah.
I mean, I would imagine, that it's funnier because I would imagine if you're a paleontologist and you actually make a living doing studying dinosaurs, that watching Jurassic Park and Jurassic World would just give you a heart attack with all the inaccuracies that you could find in there.
It says similar things with caveman movies back in the day. Like, well, scientists don't really come to see these kind of movies anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, actually, we do.
If you want to be clear, the Flintstones is basically how young Earth creationists view cavemen.
Totally.
Yeah, I've tried to talk to people about that. So just about everyone I interact with on a daily basis is a scholar of the ancient world and is just much more knowledgeable about history than just about anything else in the world because it's what they do. I was trying to explain the historical worldview that I was raised with, growing up in a extremely Christian, extremely conservative, extremely backward, ignorant environment in Waxahachie, Texas.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was awful. Don't even go there. It's a horrible place. But there's kind of this view that I was raised with that, like, basically the Greeks are essentially the beginning of history. And that sort of roughly coincides with Bible times. But then the Greeks were like, they practiced homosexuality. They were basically like Sodom and Gomorrah. So their civilization died. And then the Romans were pretty terrible. And then they became Christian. So they were successful. And, fast forward through European Christian culture all the way to today. And that's essentially world history. That's literally the only knowledge that some people have of it. And that's basically the view of world history that I was raised with until I started learning about it. And if you have that view, then I feel like young Earth creationism isn't really that big a step. It's not totally outlandish because it doesn't contradict that view in any way. It actually fits neatly into it. It's like, well, the first things we know about were right after the creation of the world, naturally, and that's about, a few thousand years ago.
Well, oddly enough, civilization itself goes back 6,000 years to when they think the world began. But other than that,
Right.
it's then you got on the other side of the extreme, you got the new atheist bad history, which just mucks it up just as bad.
I think anytime people have too much of a bias, like I always say, everybody has some amount of bias in their thinking. That's just human nature, is totally unavoidable. But anytime you're choosing your facts based on some preset belief that you want to match to those facts, you're just going to get nonsense.
Basically, feelings over facts.
Yeah, I don't want to quote. Is that like a Ben Shapiro? I think it's like Ben Shapiro.
Well, his is facts over feelings.
Okay.
So I'm saying the biased ones are saying feelings over facts.
It always frustrates me when anyone claims to be thinking using facts. Like, I'm thinking using facts and everyone else is using feelings. Everybody in the entire world is thinking using feelings. I mean, my understanding of these things is also strongly rooted to emotional states. It's just I happen to have acquired some of those associations through learning the known facts. I don't think you can divorce the two. So
unless psychopath.
Anyway, we've got
or Spock or something.
We got out in the weeds a little bit, but the other night we mentioned Djoser, Sneferu, and Khufu and them a bit. So let's talk about the most famous pharaohs, most of which are known in the New Kingdom. Let's start with the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, Tutmosis III.
Okay, what about him?
Tell us the most interesting facts about him and how significant he was.
The most interesting facts about him. All the facts I know are boring. So there's this really long interconnected lineage that eventually leads to Hatshepsut. That's the first thing that comes to mind about all the Tutmosid pharaohs. Yeah, it's not terribly interesting, I suppose. Obviously, a highly successful pharaoh, and his success probably enabled a secure and strong enough government that would promote a female pharaoh. So, there are very few female pharaohs. We don't really know how, to what extent Egyptian society was, totally patriarchal in its thinking. But female pharaohs are quite rare in Egyptian history. The relative number of male to female pharaohs is obviously very, very high. Mm-hmm. So you have to imagine that there's some extraordinary circumstance, and that period of wealth and stability probably enabled something slightly unorthodox, like a female pharaoh. I think Hatshepsut is much more interesting, honestly. I mean, that's obviously because that's the direction I'm veering in.
It's often said that she was the first female pharaoh, but wasn't Sobek Nefer the first one in the Middle Kingdom?
Yeah, and there's one. What is her name? In the Old Kingdom. I can't think of her name. Yeah, there's a female, a powerful female figure. Gosh, what is it? Meritneet? Is her name Meritneet? I'm just gonna look it up real quick.
But ironically, the last pharaoh of Egypt's 3,000-year history was Cleopatra.
Yeah, that is technically true. Let's see.
A woman ended Egypt's history.
Yeah, I just Googled because I was looking for the name of this woman that I can't think of, and the first thing that Meritneet. Okay, yeah, Meritneet. So she might have been a ruler. And then Sobeknef. Yeah, Sobekneferu. and then Hatshepsut. And this website that I'm looking at also lists Nefertiti because there's some uncertainty as to whether Nefertiti actually acted as pharaoh after the death of Amenhotep IV. So yeah, there could be quite a few before Hatshepsut, but no matter how you slice it, even if you estimate towards the high end and say there could have been anywhere up to say 10, there are still hundreds of male pharaohs. So yeah, can't really push the numbers up high enough to argue for equality.
Speaking of Nefertiti's husband, now for one of the most fascinating pharaohs, the heretic. Son of the magnificent Amenhotep III, who thought God was the face of the sun, Aten, and whose hasty reforms forced the Egyptians to celebrate their gods underground. What were the most significant factors of his temporary reign?
I think iconoclasm is the dominant feature. So we see evidence of like the name of Amun being chiseled off of temples. He founded a new city, Akhetaten, and moved people there to work on the building of the city. He built the temple to the Aten and then demolished it and built it again. He depicted himself really strangely in art. Some people argue that he made a move towards increased realism, or even just increased sort of rawness. So not necessarily depicting real life, but depicting things in a more sort of immediate, visceral sort of way. There are tons of opinions about him. I strongly dislike him. I dislike him. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious to me, just sort of reading between the lines, that he was like an unstable megalomaniac. He's not a very competent political leader. And I think the people debate this. I think probably right now a lot of more people would disagree with me than would agree with me. But I think the promotion of the new religion was in part an effort to just wrest power from the priesthood of Amun. And we're projecting backwards a little bit, but the priesthood of Amun eventually become as powerful as pharaohs. So it's clear that this was a powerful group of people whose power could infringe on that of the king. And I think that was a big part of his motivation. And I also think he's just an oddball. He's just an oddball in the very most basic sense of, if I'm walking to work and someone on the streets of New York City says something weird to me, I just keep walking because there's no reason anyone would do that other than they're kind of a crazy person, and I just don't want to interact with that person. I feel like there's so much in the things that Akhenaten did that kind of create that same feeling in me of like, this guy seems a bit nuts. I think I'm just going to stay away.
I think he was, if he would have let people warm up to the idea of the new faith, it would have had a lot more success, but he had to be an asshole and just rush everything because he wanted to see it in his own lifetime.
Yeah. And, he was a man who could demand the things he wanted. I think, again, not a very shrewd political leader. I think competent political leaders, and then even beyond that, kind of benevolent rulers tend to have more sense of the limitations of their power and their need to depend on the goodwill and good faith of other people in order to remain in power. Obviously, like, benevolent leaders are totally aware of that and even use it to then to acquire power in order to do good things for their people. I see no evidence of that in his life. And, in the archaeological evidence, there's indications of malnutrition and stress injuries in the burials of common people, which may or may not have been the norm in ancient Egypt. We don't really know, because we're kind of getting most of our evidence from the excavations at Akhetaten. But it still just doesn't look good for him. Really, none of the evidence makes him look like a competent, benevolent ruler.
Was he like mentally ill or?
I don't know, and
Uh,
it's really, I mean, it's hard to speculate on the like mental competence of someone you don't know who's alive today, let alone on someone who lived 3,000 years ago. But he's definitely an odd dude, and he was not a good king. So
and he was kind of feminine looking, or was that just sort of on part of the sculptor?
yeah, it might have been artistic, might have been a a deliberate artistic choice on his part. Um, I think the thing it really comes down, it's not really a matter of like gender representation so much as it is a matter of the way you make good art. So like if I want to, let's say I'm a film student and I want to make a really groundbreaking, impactful movie, there's a few ways I can try to do that. One way is I like film leaves being blown through the gutter for 6 hours and I'm like, this is art. And it's really not. It's just kind of an idea and it's not very good and nobody wants to watch it. Or I just make a very interesting, novel, good movie using the known techniques that competent filmmakers use. Like I could use techniques that Marvel movies use, but I could make high art using those techniques. And most Egyptian artistic innovation takes that form. There's a standard artistic canon. People work within it as kind of their starting point, and then they do innovative things within that canon. And I think that requires much more intelligence and creativity than just saying, "Oh, I'm going to be super edgy and just throw everything away and start over." It's just not a recipe for good art, and it's just not an indication of a skilled artist or even a very intelligent creative person.
And as I mentioned the other night, it was because of the erasure of Akhenaten and his family's legacy that King Tut's tomb was found intact, and he ended up being the most famous pharaoh of all.
Yeah,
or the most recognizable, anyway.
Kind of a lucky accident. And his tomb was actually broken into. It wasn't completely robbed, but it was breached and then resealed in antiquity. So, just kind of just a matter of luck that it wasn't totally robbed.
And just about the average person has no idea who the usurpers were, so that's kind of karma on their part.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Anyway, Ramesses, huh?
Well, I mean, another thing could also get, because people also like to bring up the like when people bring up King Tut and stuff, like there's generally this idea that there's one image that goes around where he's like this very tall, attractive Egyptian, but when we actually do study some of the like how he was described, and we actually study what we have of his remains, we found that he would have walked with a limp. He clearly just showed the signs of being an incest child, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, almost certainly he was.
So I mean, he also had I think he had twins that died in the womb.
Wasn't
the two babies buried? I vaguely remember something about that.
Wasn't his sister also his wife?
Well, yeah, but that was common with everybody.
Yeah.
Well, all all the pharaohs, that is, not the people in general.
Yeah.
Wait, was Ankh-Senamun his sister? I'm honestly, I just don't know. Maybe.
I vaguely remember her being somebody close to him.
There's really nothing surprising there. I mean, this was a common practice throughout history in totally disconnected places. Yeah.
Anyway, as for Ramesses II, when not being vilified in popular culture for being mistaken for the Pharaoh of the Exodus, which I tend to think was Amenhotep II, he's often regarded as one of the greatest pharaohs who ever lived, and a master builder, the champion of Kadesh, father of over 100 kids by many different wives, and whose giant ego would be that of past pharaohs to shame.
Jeez, imagine all the child support he'd have to pay.
Well,
he could afford it.
He didn't have to. He was the pharaoh.
Well, yeah.
He did actually. He did have to, but he could afford it.
Yeah.
All of those children would have been raised in the royal court and looked after, and that would have cost the royal treasury money.
He still ended up being the richest pharaoh, besides his father Seti. He was, half his kids. He outlived half his kids, unfortunately. But he's also, he was, considering his mummy, he was also a redhead, apparently.
Oh, is that so? I feel like I've heard that, but
he would have been.
I heard it in
actually,
connection with Seti.
There is also I think not many people know, since we did get into concubines. I was wondering, since I think not many people know the distinction between the head wife and the concubines. Would you mind, giving a little bit of a difference between the two?
Difference between the two. I mean, I don't think there's a
and just
like a major qualitative difference. There's the
go ahead.
There's like the great king's wife, which is a common phrase, and that was in his case that was Nefertari. And if you look at the tomb of Nefertari, which you should do because it's absolutely beautiful, all the walls are covered in the best Egyptian art you're going to find just about anywhere. It says like great royal wife all over the place. So that makes her, it makes her literally what it says. She is the chief royal wife. But there were other royal wives. I don't know that there's really a huge difference between them. And it's also a place where I feel like there's just really not enough specific information known about like we don't have an org structure for most Egyptian royal courts. So it's not clear. They had a lot of soft power, of course, and they were presumably always vying for position. They were always trying to position their own children to become Prince Regent and inherit the throne, because that would mean much more stable position for themselves, and probably just because they
obviously the money,
their kids. Yeah, that'd be a part of it. All the reasons people do the things they do. I don't know that there was a huge difference.
So do you think a full-on representation of Ramesses II would be a brown guy with red hair? Long red hair or short?
There are Egyptians today who have red hair, so that's fairly easy for me to imagine. I've met people who look just like that, so yeah.
Yeah, it was some kind of significance with his father, who presumably was also that, and Set was identified with the Red Desert.
Yeah, that's what immediately came to mind when you mentioned it, because I have heard it in connection with Seti as a possible explanation for why his name is Seti. Seti just means like sets, like belonging to Set. So
why would they worship a villain god that was supposed to be adversary of Horus?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I think a better comparison
supposed to be the ruler of evil.
No, definitely not. So it's kind of natural for us to reframe these relationships in the Manichaean terms that we're so used to. So, Christianity has Jesus and Satan as sort of opposites. Islam has the same kind of arrangement where you have this evil figure. That was not Set. Set was not purely evil. Set had a number of positive attributes, and he had these sort of contradictory positive and negative attributes in the same way that real people do. So you can imagine reading a book about a grizzled, take no prisoners, cowboy type character who might act violently, but also might protect innocent people from harm. Those things are sort of contradictory on the surface, but we can imagine them being reconciled in the moral code of this character. And you have to take that thinking to Set. So he was an emblem of of like masculine violence, of martial prowess, of aggression in general, of the chaotic forces of nature like storms, of the dangerous aspects of the world like the desert as opposed to the cultivated floodplain. But he defeated a pope in the journey through the underworld. So he defeated this evil snake that tried to swallow the sun every night.
Didn't Ra do that?
Well, it depends on which version you see, but I think it's most of the time it's Set who stands at the front of the solar boat and fights off this evil serpent. So his aggressiveness and Set's chaotic neutral, I guess, is the way I would frame it in those kind of character terms. He's not an evil character. He is unpredictable and powerful and potentially dangerous, but not necessarily evil.
Comes with the territory of being of dominating the desert.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was wondering, since this is a common theme that gets brought up in hieroglyphics, but is it common that you can find where people look at hieroglyphics and say, "Hey, look, that looks like X"? Like, I was reading this. I was looking at this one picture. I'll put it up, where basically they have this one hieroglyphic where it looks like a person is watching is looking in front of a computer.
Yes. This is like the 4chan thing with like the meme magic.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
Is it up?
Oh yeah, I can see the meme. And I've seen a expanded version of it where it's like I think it was taken from 4chan, where it's like a guy sitting in front of a computer and it's supposed to look like an iMac, and then there's that sort of double helix looking thing behind it, and it's labeled as like meme magic. So it's supposed to be, and then Kek, of course, is associated with, there it is. Yes. The prophecy of Kek.
Didn't that come from
word?
The Egyptian frog deity, but since we're on that.
Yeah.
Kek,
or something like that.
So there's Kaki that means
right
darkness. And it's part of, this is always associated with like Donald Trump somehow. So Kaki is a deity. It just means darkness. So there's the Ennead that we've mentioned most of the figures in the Ennead already. These are the most prominent Egyptian deities. There's also the Ogdoad, which is the group of 8 deities.
Would they be considered the equivalent of Titans, or just another race of deities along with the Ennead?
I think they should be placed side by side. I wouldn't. There's not the sort of like Titan and God relationship where one defeats the other, but there's just sort of an alternative version of these primordial deities. There's 8 of them, and they're in male-female pairs. So there's like Amun, and normally she's called Amunet, which is a bad pronunciation. Amunet's a good example of the thing I was talking about earlier, where there's kind of 2 different ways of pronouncing things. The Egyptological pronunciation would be like Emenet, and then
I thought it was Amunet.
What is it?
I thought it was Amunet.
Yeah, people say Amunet, but the U vowel is actually coming from the Coptic pronunciation of Amun. So it's that name Amunet is a blend of both pronunciation systems, creating just even worse nonsense than either one of them alone. Her name would probably be something like Amuna. Oh, we got a dog.
Beagle.
Hey there.
Sam.
So,
anyway, what?
Heket is this frog deity. And that's the name that you're actually seeing there. So the computer screen looking thing with the double helix looking thing behind it, the phonetic letters of the god's name, followed by a seated man. It's actually a seated god, which is the classifier that says, okay, these phonetic symbols in sequence spell out the name of a god as opposed to the name of something else that has that same phonetic sequence.
They ended up giving their full attention to Amun while forgetting his twin, basically.
No, I don't think so. I think it's the other. I think it works the other way, where like Amuna is kind of invented to be the female counterpart. Yeah.
That was early.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure how the sequence of events works there, but that's just my impression of it, because there are 4 male-female pairs. So if you're going to include Amun, you need a female version. Most environments that you find Amun in, he is paired with Mut, it just means mother. She's like the mother goddess, and their son Honsu or Shons. So
Did Rob have a female counterpart, or was he just alone creator par excellence?
yeah, there is a female counterpart. I don't know how it would be pronounced, like Rot, I guess.
Yeah,
there definitely is.
Yeah.
What?
I said that would be a perfect name for just like a female deity, Rot.
I know, it's so terrible.
Terrible bad puns. Anyway, I'm sure the dear audience was waiting for this one. The Bronze Age collapse, which ended Egypt's glory. Like, it would never be that great again. Egypt fell along with every other powerhouse of the time, which were globalized for that time period, I guess. Even Troy and Ugarit were destroyed forever. For the next couple centuries in Eurasia, everything is basically Mad Max. And apparently the sea people are the boogeymen usually blamed for this end of the world, but there's more to it, isn't there?
There's definitely a lot more to it. My recommended reading on this is 1177 BC by Eric Klein. It's a really great book.
Yeah, I heard his lecture.
I'm sorry?
I heard his lecture.
Oh, yeah. He has a lecture on YouTube that's really good. And he gave a talk at this year's ASOR conference where he talked about the importance of public scholarship that, obviously resonated with me, because doing things like this where I talk to people in a way that can reach the public is something that I consider to be super important for the long-term health of academia, writ large. We kind of have, I feel like we have this obligation, like I get to study these things and that's really fun, but, everybody has to be useful to society. So there's kind of a sense of, we need to make sure that we're always sharing the things we learn. And, this book and Eric Klein are really kind of the best around when it comes to that. So this book is very readable, and it will go into tons of really interesting detail about this. It's a huge topic.
That's the book. And, I recommend it because I've heard actually a bunch of nice things about it. And I also recommend, like what Engine said, the lecture that he gave as well. Because sometimes the people that do the lectures, they add more to the book than that was already there, so you might get additional information.
Yeah, almost certainly you will. And if you're a researcher, it's not really good form to just do the same material. You should be doing ongoing research that you present.
And he has a gift for storytelling to keep you interested so you don't fall asleep like most college professors.
Yeah, he's very engaging. He's very animated in the way he speaks, which is super fun. He's a nice guy.
I heard one article even compared him to Laura Croft. That's how good of an archaeologist he is.
Okay. I mean, he's a dork, though. He's about as far from a hot lady as you get.
What was that?
I said you sort of have to be when you get into that field.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. I say that affectionately because obviously I'm a massive dork too.
Yeah.
And after this, after the collapse, Egypt's power went to the high priest of Amun, who for some reason was no longer identified as Ra, until the 25th dynasty came to power, when the Nubians ruled Egypt under Shabbataka, starting with him, and by ending the third intermission period and beginning in the late period, which would end with Alexander's takeover.
Yeah, that's a very good and fast summary of a 1,000-year time span. I think that's the thing that's easy to forget when we start talking about third intermediate period and the late period. If you look at a timeline of Egyptian history, you'll see, the Old Kingdom had some legs, and then there's this short, like 200-year period not even 120 years, something like that. The first intermediate period, and we have the Middle Kingdom, and the second intermediate period is also short. I don't remember exactly how long.
100, exactly, almost exactly.
So really not that long. And then the third intermediate period is 500 years. I mean, it's so much longer than the others that it's a little misleading that they are just like first, second, and third, like as though it's three of the same thing.
And for the audience to know this, these intermediate periods between the glory days of Egypt were these unstable period of anarchies where all these people were running around claiming, I'm the Pharaoh, worship me, and they would all fight each other, and it was just utter chaos until somebody would reunite the country and get it back up and running again.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. The most accurate thing we can say is that there were periods of decentralization where there wasn't a strong central government in control of everything. That obviously has very real consequences in people's lives. I think probably the biggest consequence is to trade. And this is just, we're getting into my sort of personal, like research-based, but still personal views on things. I think one of the purposes of the central state was to prevent the abuses and excesses that come with decentralization. So, for instance, the interstate commerce clause in the Constitution was placed there for a reason. It was placed there because if you don't have something like that, then every individual state will put a toll booth at every border because that's a very easy way to make money. So the existence of phantom toll booths is a frequent sign of lack of general oversight from a central government. So consequences like that, obviously, that's hugely detrimental to trade. That's probably the same sort of problem that led to Kamoza's attack on the Hyksos. So they were charging tolls to ships traveling to Upper Egypt through the Nile that were passing through their territory. And that, I think, based on a close reading of the text, I think that was the central cause for his punitive raid against the Hyksos, was the exaction of taxes or tariffs on trade goods. So, decentralization obviously makes it very easy for any individual polity to, charge tariffs or have radically different laws that favor that government in some way. So there's all kinds of consequences for that. I think the idea that it was a period of total chaos is a stretch based on the evidence we have. Most people probably just went about their lives. Right. I mean, you could compare it to now, actually, where we have obviously a very unstable political situation. The president just got impeached and acquitted despite being very obviously objectively guilty of the thing he was accused of. That's political instability. And we all feel, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, you probably are feeling that sense of instability every day, even if your life looks more or less exactly the same now as it did 4 years ago. It's a psychological.
I always look at this post-90s cultural wasteland comparable to the fall of the Roman Empire.
Could be.
Because it was kind of like those intermediate periods.
Yeah,
Well,
it's a time of crisis, certainly.
I mean, as long as you remember, most civilizations tend to, at the longest, last about 1,000 years, but on average about 350.
I guess. Anyway, by this, what was that?
Yeah, and I'm saying, so technically, since we're only about, I think America's like 250 years old or something like that, we got like 100 years left, so that's always a good thing.
Yeah.
Time will tell, but
yeah.
by the time of the third intermediate period, when Egypt was already a shadow of its former self, obviously, but the Nubians apparently revitalized it in one last spark for a short time, and after that, it seems Egypt got conquered by every major empire after that. The Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Muslims, and it's been an Islamic hellhole ever since.
I wouldn't go quite that far.
Well, for the past few decades, anyway.
Egypt is definitely in a time of crisis now, and yeah, there's a role that religion plays in that. Certainly, I mean, the fact that the Arab Spring in Egypt didn't result in the election of an actual democratic government and just resulted in more chaos can certainly be at least partially attributed to voting along religious lines rather than political lines.
I mean, it wasn't bad in the 20th century, but now it's just kind of like that intermediate time, isn't it?
No, it was pretty rough in the 20th century too. It was pretty rough. I mean, it had a dictatorship for like 30 years.
Besides World War II, anyway.
Well, you can also blame the U.S. government for that and their ever-increasing meddling in Egypt's political affairs.
Well, it's complicated. Camp David probably saved Egypt from just beating its military to death against the wall that is Israel. So that I mean, the roughly $2 billion in aid that the U.S. provides to Egypt in exchange for their agreement to cease hostilities against Israel was doubly beneficial. Fighting a war against Israel was only something that Egyptian political leaders were doing because it was popular with their people. It was not a wise political move on their part. So having a reason to say we're not going to do that anymore and we're going to get paid for it, it's a pretty good deal. I think the Egyptians were very happy with that, actually. Yeah, and I'm not an expert on modern Egyptian politics either, and it is very complicated, of course.
Anyway, tell us about what's the most interesting you could tell us about the very brief Nubian period? Which, fun fact, the last of them, Taharka, was in the Bible.
Yeah, maybe is.
There was some kind of confusion as to who the first Nubian pharaoh was. Was it Shabataka, or Shabiku, or which one of them?
I'm honestly not sure. I think Shabaka was. Yeah, I'm really just not sure. My instinct is to say Shabaka because that was what I was taught at some point, but short of looking at the evidence right now, I couldn't really say for sure. The Nubian period was very interesting. It was, like you said, it kind of revitalized Egypt. We might think of native Egyptians being sort of resistant to this foreign power, but all the evidence we have suggests that they considered the Nubian pharaohs to be totally legitimate, whereas like Persian satraps were never granted any sort of legitimacy and hated. There's a Coptic text from trying to remember the date. It's much later, like the 7th century AD. We're talking like 1,000 years after the Persian period, that paints the Persians as these horrible monsters. We see nothing like that about the Nubian pharaohs. So there was definitely a difference in view among Egyptians towards them. It probably has a lot to do with events leading up to the Nubian dynasty. So there was always lots of connections between Nubia and Egypt. Normally, Egypt launched raids against Nubia in order to exact tribute. So Nubia had this kind of quality that was varying between independent and sometimes sort of like a vassal state, and other times just like a conquered territory. So there was a lot of Egyptian culture and religion that was blended with the local culture. And then when the Nubian pharaohs came to Egypt, they brought worship of Amun with them. And Pia, in his description of his invasion of Egypt from the south, he spends more time talking about the worship of Amun than he does really talking about the military campaign. I mean, he almost treats it like a sort of religious pilgrimage. And I think that certainly went a long way to grant them legitimacy, because they really weren't totally culturally foreign. And they're just super interesting guys. I don't know. I love the Nubian pharaohs. Yeah, there's so much cool stuff in there. The pyramids that you've seen, like the Meroitic pyramids. Wait.
Oh yeah, they did bring back pyramids.
Too late. That's too late. That doesn't feel right. Anyway, the Nubian pyramids, the really pointy ones, are they kind of look odd to us now because they don't look like the Giza pyramids, but they actually weren't built on the model of the Giza pyramids. They're built on the model of Theban funerary monuments that had evolved over the course of hundreds and thousands of years to become these much smaller, much pointier, tall and narrow pyramids that were over tombs. So we can see all sorts of interesting things. We can see the evolution of Egyptian funerary traditions reflected in the things that later Nubians did.
So they loved the Nubians basically, but they hated the Assyrians and the Persians, and then they loved Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander was hailed as a liberator because they despised the Persians. I mean, obviously, it's kind of a be careful what you wish for situation, because the Ptolemaic rulers,
they ended up being assholes also.
They just kind of treated Egypt as a personal piggy bank, and then they were conquered by the Romans, who of course treated Egypt as a breadbasket and just automated the process of extracting wealth from the country. And Egypt was a colony all the way until the mid 20th century from that point forward. So I think that goes back to what you're saying about, modern Egypt and its economically depressed state. Egypt is the most colonized nation in the history of the world. It was a colony of European governments for how long? For 2,200 years. If you think about the legacy of colonialism in, the Belgian Congo, where obviously the Belgians committed horrible atrocities and severely damaged that country's culture and economy, they weren't there for 2,200 years.
Then you got 20th century, you got the French and the Germans competing over them, playing. Then you got
the British and the French. The French led an invasion to Egypt, which is actually the origin story of modern Egyptology. So Napoleon's expedition in the late 18th century is really the starting point of Egyptology.
Because he was with exploring the land of the pharaohs and uncovering their secrets.
Yeah.
Like by that time, people just forgot about them, and aside from what they hear in the Bible, and people have long forgot. Even in Cleopatra's time, they've forgotten what the pyramids were built for.
Yeah, I mean, there are people today who still don't know. So yeah.
So, any final thoughts?
That was a very long trek through Egyptian history. I think I'm probably going to go to bed soon so I can get up and go to work in the morning. This kitty cat's already sleeping, so she's decided that it's bedtime.
Yeah. I'm going to be eating pretty soon, so yeah, I had a great conversation. This was very good. I felt like I learned a lot.
All right, I'll link your site in the description again, and the dear audience can find you whenever they're curious about Egypt.
Yeah, send me questions. Always happy to answer questions to the best of my ability anyway. And thank you guys so much for having me. It's been really fun.
No problem, man.
All right, see you next time. Go check him out, and stay tuned for the next episode. Adios.